Every era of scientific progress contains shadows research that flickers briefly into view before being sealed away, redirected, or quietly erased from the public record. Some of it fades because the work stalled. Some vanishes because it strayed into territory too unstable or too controversial, and some disappears because it brushed against possibilities certain authorities would rather keep hidden. Hollywood has always hunted for ideas along this boundary, drawing inspiration from speculative papers, experimental laboratories, defense-funded prototypes, and theoretical frameworks not yet ready for daylight. Usually, these influences remain harmless curiosities, footnotes in interviews, anecdotes from advisors, fragments of technical language meant to make a scene feel authentic. But on rare occasions, a film unknowingly anchors itself to scientific work that later becomes restricted. And when that happens, the movie becomes something stranger than its creators intended, a surviving remnant of research that officially no longer exists. In these cases, the traces are subtle but unmistakable terminology, matching papers later withdrawn, conceptual diagrams mirroring prototypes that vanished from archives, visual designs resembling experiments erased from conference records. Sometimes a technical advisor steps back from publicity. Sometimes a studio stops acknowledging who provided scientific guidance. And occasionally, a researcher who once spoke openly about their contributions chooses to say nothing at all. This episode examines 15 sci-fi films that appear to have captured glimpses of real scientific efforts, ideas, models, and early-stage discoveries that slipped behind classified curtains shortly after the films reached the public. Whether these connections were coincidences, intuitive extrapolations, or something more direct, one fact remains: the cinematic versions endured, even when the research that inspired them did not. In each of these films, the fictional narrative may have been speculative, but the science behind them left behind a peculiar footprint, one that hints at breakthroughs, quietly buried beneath layers of restricted access, unacknowledged funding lines, or institutional silence. The question isn't whether the films predicted the future, it's whether they momentarily revealed a version of the present that someone later decided should disappear. 1. The Matrix, 1999. The Matrix is renowned for its philosophical questions and groundbreaking visuals, but its deeper scientific foundation is rooted in early neurological simulation research that was more accessible in the 1990 seconds than it is today. During that era, cognitive scientists investigated how sensory data could be decoded, substituted, and reconstructed inside artificial environments. These studies explored synthetic perceptual fields, multisensory substitution layers, and closed-loop neural interpretation concepts that quietly circulated through conference materials and internal research. Notes. Yet, soon after the film's cultural impact expanded, many of these documents were withdrawn or substantially edited. Several labs that had once published exploratory papers on sensory environment emulation transitioned to more guarded research programs. A series of technical reports discussing high-density neural mapping vanished from online archives, leaving behind only indirect citations. The film's depiction of humans interfacing directly with a simulated world mirrors experimental designs from a seldom referenced neural docking concept. Drafts outlining this idea were shared among neuroscience graduate programs, but were later sealed when their sponsoring institution underwent a structural reorganization. Attempts to locate the original materials today yield only references to archived internal documentation. Even the visual glitches inside the Matrix, moments where simulated structures recompute parallel speculative discussions from late 90 seconds workshops on dynamic environment synthesis. These workshops briefly entertained the idea of real-time perceptual reconstruction, but ceased publishing proceedings after 2001. A consultant involved during the early script phase later removed his name from related materials, stating that the models we discussed have since moved into different oversight channels. Crew members recall documents showing neural visualization formats that were more technical than what ended up on screen. In hindsight, The Matrix appears less like a bold leap of imagination and more like a cinematic impression of research that drifted into restricted or proprietary environments. Its dystopian simulation may be fictional, but the scientific primitives that inspired it existed long enough to influence the film before disappearing into sealed archives and leaving the movie as an accidental record of ideas no longer openly acknowledged. 2 Moon, 2009. While Moon is celebrated for its minimalist presentation and psychological weight, Its core themes regarding cloning and engineered labor reflect experimental trajectories in cellular replication research that were quietly reshaped in the mid-2000s. During that time, several biology labs were studying accelerated organism development, enhanced somatic reprogramming, and techniques for stabilizing artificially produced tissues. Early drafts of these studies circulated in conference posters and departmental working papers, though much of the material was later revised or removed from public databases. The production team sought insight from researchers familiar with tissue regeneration cycles and mechanisms governing cellular imprint retention. Their discussions influenced the film's portrayal of individuals engineered for labor while carrying echoes of fragmented memory. A few years after the film debuted, documents referencing rapid maturation systems and epigenetic stability experiments began disappearing from university servers. Some were replaced with generic summaries. Others were absorbed into privately funded projects that ceased publishing results. One of the film's most striking parallels is its depiction of memory continuity across multiple clones. This concept mirrors findings from an obscure study conducted in 2007 that examined inherited cellular markers related to artificial memory retention. The study's preliminary notes were available briefly before being pulled, and the researchers involved later declined to elaborate on their results. Additionally, a scientific consultant associated with the film withdrew from public interviews, citing new obligations tied to restricted research activities. Colleagues indicated that his lab had recently shifted focus toward classified biomedical initiatives. Viewed today, Moon feels less like speculative fiction and more like a distorted reflection of bioengineering research whose public traces grew faint soon after the film's release. Its quiet lunar facility and engineered workforce echo scientific ambitions that once appeared in open literature but have since retreated into confidential or privatized channels. 3 Interstellar, 2014. Although Interstellar is best known for its emotional resonance, its scientific architecture reflects theoretical work that briefly surfaced before becoming difficult to trace. In the early 2010 seconds, several physics teams were exploring unconventional gravitational geometries, exotic space-time distortions, and speculative models involving higher dimensional curvature. These ideas appeared in a handful of grant proposals and academic workshops documents that were publicly accessible for a short window before being revised, retracted, or consolidated into opaque research programs. During production, the filmmakers collaborated with physicists who were engaged in this frontier domain. They discussed equations related to nonlinear gravitational flows and the behavior of fields within compressed spatial regions. Strangely, some of the same diagrams used to visualize wormhole structures in the film resemble figures from a research proposal submitted to a federal science agency in 2011. That proposal later disappeared from online archives, leaving no trace beyond a few citations in older symposium notes. The film's Tesseract sequence, the depiction of time encoded across multi-dimensional planes, bears striking resemblance to speculative models once shown at a theoretical physics conference. Attendees recall diagrams illustrating time-indexed information fields, but those materials were not published and were reportedly collected after the session. A scientific advisor involved during early development declined to discuss his contributions after the film's release. When questioned about the accuracy of the physics, he responded cryptically, "The calculations we shared then are not the ones available to the public now." Even the portrayal of gravitational anomalies affecting time aligns with exploratory drafts on temporal dilation fields, papers that appeared briefly in university repositories before being removed. Today, Interstellar stands as a cinematic echo of theoretical avenues that briefly interacted with public research before shifting into obscured academic or governmental channels. Its celestial mechanics and dimensional constructs may appear fantastical, but they resemble research threads that quietly slipped out of view shortly after the film gave the public a fictionalized glimpse. 4. The Terminator, 1984. The Terminator is often remembered for its relentless action and dystopian vision of machine dominance, but the film's depiction of autonomous weapons systems aligns with emerging robotics research that existed in fragmented form during the early 1980 seconds. Several laboratories were experimenting with preliminary targeting heuristics, adaptive sensor modules, and rudimentary machine vision systems technologies intended to reduce human involvement in high-risk operational environments. These prototypes were crude, yet their foundational logic resembles the film's mechanized antagonist more closely than most assume. At first, some of this early research appeared in academic journals. Papers referenced autonomous threat prioritization, pattern-isolated target tracking, and self-correcting sensor interpretation. But shortly after the film reached mainstream popularity, many of those documents were withdrawn or revised into stripped-down versions, lacking their original detail. Research groups dissolved or were absorbed into new institutional structures with significantly reduced transparency. The iconic point-of-view sequences showing the Terminator's rapidly shifting visual overlays resemble internal prototypes for early machine vision HUDs, a set of designs leaked years later and removed almost immediately. These prototypes displayed crosshair matrices and multi-spectrum filters that mirrored the aesthetic seen in the film. Another curious thread involves a robotics engineer listed in preliminary production notes. His name was quietly removed from final credits. Former co-workers suggested he had ties to a defense initiative evaluating semi-autonomous field units. After the film's release, he declined to discuss his involvement, stating only that the overlap between fiction and research became too narrow. The film's central idea, an AI assuming independent military command, parallels speculative internal memos circulated during the Cold War's technological arms race. These memos, once accessible, disappeared from archives by the late 1980 seconds. Today, the Terminator stands as an exaggerated, cinematic echo of early autonomy research. Its dystopian vision stretches reality, but its scientific scaffolding traces back to research pathways that later migrated into classified environments, leaving the film as a rare fictional shell reflecting experiments no longer acknowledged. 5. Wargames 1983. Though Wargames presents itself as a Cold War thriller centered on accidental escalation, the film draws heavily from strategic automation research that was only loosely visible during the early 1980 seconds. At that time, defense think tanks explored algorithmic systems capable of evaluating nuclear response scenarios without direct human initiation. Early documents outlined experiments using decision tree models, recursive scenario testing, and probabilistic escalation forecasting ideas that overlap closely with the film's central computer system. Initially, some of these materials were available through public-facing technical reports. Analysts referenced automated strategic arbitration and recursive wargame loops, describing them as theoretical exercises. But following the film's unexpected cultural impact, many of these documents were pulled from circulation. Several were replaced with sanitized versions that softened or removed details about autonomous escalation modeling. Others disappeared entirely, surviving only as citations in subsequent papers. The resemblance between the WOPR interface and diagrams from early strategic simulation prototypes is also difficult to ignore. A few leaked documents from that period contain branching matrices and outcome analysis visualizations nearly identical to those seen in the film. Those leaks were scrubbed quickly, with the hosting sites issuing takedown notices referencing sensitive archival material. One advisor, affiliated with the film, an applied mathematician working on conflict resolution algorithms, abruptly withdrew from public academic work soon after the movie's debut. Former colleagues hinted he had joined a project that shifted into a compartmentalized environment. Additionally, early script drafts included more explicit representations of automated decision structures, but these were removed at the request of a consultant who reportedly recognized similarities to a classified prototype under evaluation at the time. Viewed today, Wargames serves as an unintentional snapshot of research trajectories that briefly brushed public visibility. Its dramatized crisis reflects a set of algorithmic frameworks that quietly migrated into classified domains, leaving the film as one of the few surviving windows into early autonomous governance concepts tested during the Cold War's shadow. 6. Edge of Tomorrow, 2014. While Edge of Tomorrow is framed as a looping sci-fi war spectacle, its tactical prediction elements echo several research projects that briefly surfaced before fading into restricted territory. During its development, the creative team consulted analysts studying emerging battlefield forecasting systems, programs designed to run thousands of simulated engagements to determine optimal strategic responses. These systems were primitive compared to the film's depiction, yet early documentation revealed surprising sophistication in their algorithmic frameworks. In the late 2000s, papers discussing multi-phase temporal modeling, projected engagement matrices, and adaptive combat recomputation appeared in niche academic channels. For a short time, these documents were publicly accessible, outlining concepts eerily similar to the film's constant tactical recalculation. But in the years surrounding the film's release, those studies disappeared. Some were archived behind new security protocols, others were replaced with generic abstracts missing their technical depth. The film's visualization of battlefield prediction, streams of shifting vectors, recalculated threat lines, and dynamic repositioning resembles demonstrations from an early simulation prototype shown at a closed-door symposium. Attendees later described the prototype's interface as uncomfortably close to what appeared in the movie. Shortly after, all references to the prototype vanished from digital repositories. Even more intriguing is the similarity between the Mimic's swarm-like coordination and a rumored autonomous drone research project focused on emergent group behavior. Leaked diagrams from that project showed convergence patterns nearly identical to the creature movements depicted in the film. The leak was removed within hours, leaving only low-resolution screenshots circulating among enthusiasts. A technical consultant who initially offered insight into machine learning-driven battlefield models later asked not to be credited. When questioned, he mentioned that some related programs transitioned into phases where public commentary isn't appropriate anymore. Today, Edge of Tomorrow feels less like a fantasy of infinite retries and more like a cinematic reflection of predictive combat systems that momentarily surfaced in public awareness before being absorbed into classified research avenues. 7. Transcendence, 2014. Transcendence pushes the idea of consciousness uploading to a dramatic extreme, yet many of its scientific underpinnings mirror genuine experimental work that briefly surfaced before becoming inaccessible. In the early 2010 seconds, neuroscientists were exploring detailed neural state mapping, large-scale connectome simulations, and methods for capturing persistent cognitive signatures in high-density data structures. These projects were discussed in niche workshops and preprint outlines, often hinting at their long-term goal not to recreate consciousness but to approximate its structural patterns. The filmmakers consulted advisors familiar with these areas, and their insights shaped the film's representation of evolving machine intelligence. Yet, in the years following the movie's release, several of these early studies vanished from public archives. Papers on neural pattern stabilization, previously viewable through institutional libraries, were replaced with cryptic notices about access revisions, a dataset that some believe influenced the film's visualizations. One focused on multi-layer cortical correlation mapping was reclassified and removed entirely. The film's depiction of cascading neural network growth mirrors theoretical exercises circulated internally among cognitive simulation researchers. These exercises speculated that sufficiently detailed models might begin generating emergent substructures. Public documentation of these discussions ceased around 2015. Even the film's lattice-like visualization of consciousness resembles diagrams once shown at a small academic symposium on multidimensional neural encoding. Attendees noted that the diagrams were collected immediately after the presentation and never made available online. One scientific consultant quietly withdrew from participating in promotional interviews. When asked why, he hinted that the boundaries of current research aren't as open as they were when we first spoke. Today, Transcendence reads like a fictional rendering of scientific ambitions that later retreated into classified or privatized research corridors. The film's digital ascension may be fantasy, but the experimental groundwork behind it, now largely inaccessible, suggests ideas that were closer to reality than most viewers ever realized. 8. Minority Report, 2002. Although Minority Report is usually celebrated for its futuristic world-building, its predictive policing foundation aligns uncomfortably well with early behavioral forecasting research pursued around the turn of the millennium. At that time, analysts were experimenting with probability mapping engines that attempted to anticipate human actions based on layered data inputs, location history, social patterns, environmental triggers, and statistical behavior clusters. These studies appeared in specialized conference proceedings before being folded into government-backed projects with reduced transparency. As the film moved through production, the creative team was granted access to research groups exploring trend projection algorithms. Early drafts of the screenplay included visual references drawn directly from academic papers on multi-axis prediction lattices. After the film's release, many of those papers vanished from open-access repositories. Some were replaced with notices citing archival updates, while others were scrubbed entirely. The film's iconic gesture-based interface also mirrors prototypes from an experimental visualization lab investigating real-time outcome modeling. These prototypes combined gesture recognition with branching scenario computation, an uncanny match for the pre-crime displays. After 2003, references to these systems disappeared from the lab's annual reports. Even more mysterious are the similarities between the film's glowing prediction webs and images leaked briefly from a probability mapping experiment run under a defense-oriented research arm. These images, showing luminous branching timelines nearly identical to those seen in the film, were removed from circulation within days. One researcher who advised on early visual concepts stated years later that some of the material they referenced is not in public circulation anymore. He declined all further questions. Today, Minority Report stands as an unsettling echo of behavioral forecasting research that once crossed into public view before retreating behind institutional walls. Its imagined future of preemptive policing may be fictional, but the scaffolding beneath it was real enough to disappear from the scientific landscape soon after the film brought its ideas to the mainstream. 9. Ex Machina, 2014. Ex Machina is remembered for its elegant minimalism, but its portrayal of emergent machine intelligence resembles several research paths that were only partly visible in early 2010 seconds AI labs. At the time, a number of research groups were experimenting with adaptive cognitive architectures, systems designed to learn behaviors not from programming, but from recursive, self-generated models. These exploratory frameworks sought to replicate subtle human patterns, emotional intuition, spontaneous inference, and context-sensitive interaction. They appeared briefly in preprint archives before disappearing behind institutional restructuring. During the film's creation, the production team consulted specialists working on deep learning heuristics capable of modeling conversational nuance. Their work included early emotional state classifiers and prediction engines that relied on micro-hesitation, gaze shifts, and vocal tremor analysis. Shortly after the film's release, several white papers discussing these tools were redacted or replaced with revised abstracts that omitted key methodologies. One research group dissolved into a private partnership, and its earlier publications vanished from public databases within months. The film's depiction of Ava reading behavior with uncanny precision mirrors a real algorithm tested in a limited defense-funded program. This algorithm analyzed high-resolution behavioral footage to predict intention trajectories work that surfaced in a leaked research summary in 2012 before the summary was removed. The visual language in the film's data mapping sequences bears a distinct resemblance to diagrams from that same leaked report. Another curious detail, one AI researcher who originally agreed to advise on the film later rescinded credit, stating that the projects he had referenced were no longer appropriate to discuss openly. Crew members confirmed he had shown them unfinished models for emergent behavior simulations, models that never reappeared in academics' literature. Viewed today, Ex Machina feels less like an exercise in speculative drama and more like a polished artifact capturing an early moment when AI research began slipping behind closed doors. The film's intimate portrait of synthetic consciousness may reflect experiments that were once public but gradually withdrew into classified or proprietary domains. 10. Upgrade, 2018. Upgrade is often praised for its sharp choreography and chilling vision of human-machine integration, but the film's core idea, a neural implant capable of overriding and augmenting human decisions, mirrors several experimental technologies that were in development during the mid-2010 seconds. At that time, research teams were building prototypes for adaptive neuro-interfaces that could interpret intention signals and translate them into precise motor actions. These studies were openly referenced in grant summaries and conference posters, suggesting a future in which neural implants might assist individuals with impaired mobility. But within a short period, information about the highest bandwidth prototypes began to contract. Papers on real-time intention decoding, predictive motor signal correction, and autonomous neural response systems disappeared from digital repositories. Some were replaced with placeholder messages noting restricted updates, Labs that had once shared breakthroughs on neural cortex mapping shifted abruptly to safer, narrowly defined projects. The film's portrayal of a chip capable of asserting its own judgment reflects the structure of a rumored research module developed under a defense-funded initiative. The initiative reportedly explored accelerated threat response computation, an implant interpreting danger signals faster than human reflexes. A cache of internal slides describing this concept briefly surfaced online in 2016 before being removed without explanation. Even more telling is the withdrawal of one technical advisor who initially contributed to the film. He later asked not to be listed in the credits and avoided all interviews. Crew members recalled him referencing sensitive models related to neural override conditions models that, according to him, were being reassessed under new access restrictions. Today, Upgrade resonates less as speculative fiction and more as a stylized echo of research that edged toward militarized neurology. Its sleek narrative of enhanced control hints at the remnants of investigations that quietly entered classified or proprietary channels, leaving the film as a faint reflection of technologies no longer discussed in open scientific circles. 11. The Fly, 1986. Despite being remembered for its grotesque transformation sequences, The Fly owes much of its scientific plausibility to early molecular pattern research that existed only on the fringe of public knowledge. In the early 1982s, a handful of laboratories explored theoretical approaches to disassembling biological structures into encoded informational states, essentially conceptual models for understanding whether life could be reduced, transmitted, and reconstructed at a molecular level. These ideas were far from accepted science, but drafts circulated in symposium papers and preliminary studies that toyed with the boundaries of biological identity. As the film's production progressed, the team consulted advisors familiar with high-resolution cellular mapping and experimental biological scanning techniques. Their insights shaped the teleportation pod's eerie precision. Yet shortly after the film's release, several of these early documents began disappearing from public access. Research into structured bioimprinting, cellular deconstruction, and molecular memory retention either shifted direction or was archived under ambiguous project codes. The internal layout of the pods, their geometric frames, symmetrical patterns, and concentric scanning conduits bears an uncanny resemblance to the experimental apparatus used in a little-known micropattern analysis project. A dissertation describing this apparatus, once available through a university library, quietly vanished during a digital archive overhaul. A consultant credited in early drafts of the film's publicity materials later removed his name entirely. His colleagues hinted that he had been part of a government-funded project examining high-density biological imaging, one that later entered a classification review. When approached for comment, he declined, suggesting that the scientific parallels were closer than intended. Though The Fly transforms speculative concepts into horror, its underlying framework preserves elements of research that quietly slipped into inaccessible domains. The film's grotesque metamorphosis may be fiction, but the scientific scaffolding supporting it reflects experimental pathways that no longer appear in public records, rendering the movie a strange time capsule of ideas extracted from the edge of biological exploration. 12. Gattaca, 1997. When Gattaca debuted, many saw it simply as a haunting portrayal of genetic destiny. But beneath its restrained aesthetic lies a striking resemblance to experimental genetic selection research that was only partially visible to the public during the mid-1990s. At the time, several biomedical teams were exploring early frameworks for genotype forecasting, hereditary risk prediction, and pre-selection methodologies designed to evaluate biological viability before birth. These efforts were not mainstream, but existed in the margins of conferences and private grant proposals where researchers speculated about the limits of genetic planning. During the film's development, the creative team consulted scientists who studied foundational elements of genomic probability modeling and emerging ideas about phenotype expectation mapping. These concepts were still theoretical, yet specific enough to shape the film's crisp, unsettling logic. But within a few years of the movie's release, much of the material referenced by its advisors either disappeared or was heavily edited. Papers that once described pre-birth evaluation matrices were withdrawn for procedural adjustments that never resurfaced. One of the most intriguing overlaps involves the film's clinical ranking system, its cold, number-driven genetic scoring. These charts echo diagrams from a now-lost proposal that outlined genotype filtering mechanisms, a document briefly accessible before being absorbed into a private research consortium. Several scientists who had spoken openly about early genetic selection models stopped discussing them entirely by the early 2000s. There was also a lab known for work on inherited cellular memory markers, rumored to have exchanged early findings with consultants from the film. That lab's research focus abruptly shifted, and previous publications were scrubbed from its archive. The most cryptic moment came when a researcher, once cited as an informal advisor, refused to revisit the topic. "The data you're asking about," he said, "is not in public hands anymore." Viewed today, Gattaca functions like a preserved record of genetic ambitions that later retreated into restricted or privatized research. Its quiet world of engineered identities may be fictional, but the scientific contours behind it feel uncomfortably real and deliberately obscured. 13. Contact 1997. Although Contact is revered for its emotional and philosophical themes, the film's technological backbone rests on concepts that were closer to emerging scientific proposals than the public realized. During pre-production, the creators engaged with physicists working on high-energy field manipulation, unconventional propulsion frameworks, and exploratory models of space-time curvature. At the time, these topics were quietly debated in specialized research groups, with early drafts of theoretical papers circulating among graduate departments and government-funded study teams. Within a few years of the film's release, many of those documents became impossible to find. Research proposals involving rotational energy routing and multi-axis magnetic stabilization ideas central to the movie's iconic machine were removed from grant databases or replaced with placeholder entries citing archival restructuring. One particular proposal, submitted in the early 1992s and noted for its unusual energy sequencing diagrams, disappeared from both digital and physical records by the end of the decade. The film's technical consultants also became elusive. Production notes once listed a specialist in nonlinear field harmonics, but his name was quietly removed from later editions. Crew members recalled that he provided examples of experimental models that were in circulation only briefly before being absorbed into a sealed review. He later declined all attempts to revisit his involvement. What stands out most is how the film represents the machine's oscillating energy lattice, a structure of nested geometric patterns strikingly similar to illustrations from an obscure conference presentation on exotic field fluctuations. Attendees of that conference noted that several visual aids were confiscated afterward and never redistributed. Carl Sagan's own notes mention conversations with researchers who spoke cautiously about the boundaries of what they were permitted to reveal. Some hinted that parallel studies had shifted into restricted environments. Today, Contact feels like a cinematic echo of scientific proposals that briefly surfaced before slipping into classified channels. The film's extraordinary machine may be fictional, but the research threads it reflects seem to have been withdrawn almost as soon as the public glimpsed their outlines. 14. Colossus, the Forbin Project, 1970. Colossus, the Forbin Project presents itself as a straightforward cautionary tale about automation gone too far, yet its inner workings mirror technical concepts that were far from fictional in the late 1960s. Several research initiatives of that era explored the possibility of reducing human hesitation in high-risk military responses through algorithmic models capable of evaluating incoming threats. These initiatives, which appeared briefly in academic journals, discussed computational logic structures that bore a striking resemblance to the decision pathways depicted in the film's omniscient supercomputer. Once the film entered public conversation, many of the documents referencing these autonomous command frameworks began to disappear. Papers that once outlined structural models for automatic escalation responses were removed or reissued with vague terminology. Even the phrase systemic autonomous oversight, which appeared in notes exchanged between the production team and consulting experts, was replaced in later publications by generic references to monitoring architectures. The film's internal logic diagrams, shown fleetingly on screens, reflect the same branching matrix patterns discovered in prototypes belonging to early defense computation programs. Researchers familiar with these prototypes have hinted that certain sequences in the movie aligned too closely with diagrams that should not have been publicly recognizable. One mathematician who briefly consulted on the script declined further interviews, remarking that the project he had been connected to transitioned into a domain where discussion is constrained. By the early 1980s, nearly all publicly acknowledged work on autonomous strategic computation had been reorganized or reclassified. The only remaining traces of the original research appear in scattered footnotes and derivative studies. Viewed today, Colossus reads like more than a parable about machines taking control. It resembles a fictional shell built around real modeling systems that quietly migrated into obscured, highly controlled research pathways, leaving the film as one of the few surviving reflections of a technological ambition that officially disappeared. 15. The Andromeda Strain, 1971. When The Andromeda Strain arrived in theaters, audiences admired its clinical precision, the way it portrayed containment systems, environmental sterilization, and crisis-level biological analysis with an almost documentary level of detail. But the film's unsettling authenticity wasn't accidental. During its development, the production team contacted several specialists who had been working on early biodefense models intended to simulate responses to unknown pathogens. These studies were still part of open scientific discussion in the late 1960s, tucked into symposium notes and preliminary research papers that speculated on how laboratories might manage organisms with unpredictable behaviors. What makes the film's accuracy more remarkable is how swiftly many of those same studies vanished from public circulation after its release. Research into ultra-tight containment protocols, biological pattern isolation, and automated hazard assessment was gradually removed from university archives, replaced by bland summaries that concealed methodological specifics. One of the labs rumored to have provided background insights to the filmmakers abruptly changed administrative structure, and its early papers were reclassified under a broader, ambiguous environmental analysis program. Even more curious is the film's depiction of advanced laboratory automation, robotic manipulators, sealed multi-level facilities, and micro-scale analytic instruments. These technologies seemed futuristic at the time, yet resemble experimental hardware later confirmed to have existed under limited defense-oriented contracts. The consultant who oversaw these details reportedly refused interviews years later, stating only that he couldn't clarify which concepts were speculative and which were not. A journalist attempting to track down one of the original scientific advisors in the 1990 seconds found that he had stopped discussing his involvement altogether. His only comment was that the ideas referenced during the film's preparation were no longer part of the accessible scientific record. Today, the Andromeda Strain feels strangely prophetic, not because it predicts future biology, but because it appears to have preserved a snapshot of research strands that quietly slipped into restricted channels. Its sterile corridors and silent laboratories may not merely represent Hollywood imagination, but echoes of real experiments someone later decided should remain unseen. Bonus: The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. Among the science fiction films of the 1970 seconds, The Man Who Fell to Earth occupies an unusual position not because of its surreal tone, but because its technology resembles experimental work that briefly surfaced in scientific literature before disappearing. During the early to mid-1970 seconds, a handful of laboratories explored unconventional materials, optical frequency modulation, and high-efficiency energy transfer systems. These studies were mentioned in obscure technical bulletins, often described with deliberately vague phrasing and limited citations. The film's alien devices layered, translucent constructions with refractive geometries echo structural designs from an experimental proposal on coherent energy transduction mediums. That proposal circulated privately among researchers after a 1974 symposium before being withdrawn from publication entirely. Those who attended recalled a design featuring nested lattice components capable of channeling multi-spectrum power flows, a description that bears a remarkable resemblance to the technology portrayed on screen. Even more intriguing is the film's depiction of rapid data transmission through compressed multi-frequency bursts. A similar technique appeared in a now-lost research effort investigating ultra-dense communication signals for long-range transmission. The program dissolved without notice after its funding was absorbed into a broader classified initiative. The few references that survive confirm that the research existed, but no detailed documents remain accessible. A physicist associated with early consultations for the film later admitted he had shown the production team discarded drafts from an experimental materials group. When asked years later whether the drafts were truly obsolete, he replied, "They're not available, and that's all I can say." Today, The Man Who Fell to Earth feels like a cinematic artifact, preserving details from scientific pathways that slipped into obscurity. The film's enigmatic technology, far from being purely visionary, may represent the last publicly visible traces of research that migrated into classified or proprietary domains, leaving the movie as a fragile echo of ideas erased from the scientific record. If these films truly captured fragments of research that later slipped behind restricted walls, then each title becomes more than entertainment. They become accidental windows into scientific trails that someone later chose to close. And if cinema can preserve pieces of work that no longer appear in the public archive, what else might be hiding in the shadows between fiction and reality? If you want more explorations of concealed technologies, vanished experiments, and the films that quietly documented them, subscribe to Vaulted Futures and continue uncovering the stories that were never meant to survive.